Thank you for being here, everybody. My name is Whitney Zeigler. I'm the founder of Big Rocks Organizing LLC, and this is Wine and Wisdom with Whitney on Wednesdays. And I'm so excited for our special guest who's here with us today. Her name is Kathie England, and her company is called Time for Success Incorporated. She's a professional organizing colleague of mine. She launched her business in July of 2002. She's a graduate of Whittier College. Her career began as an elementary school teacher. After 10 years of teaching, she obtained a master's degree in communication disorders from California State University, Fullerton, and became a speech-language pathologist. This profession opened many opportunities for Kathie in healthcare, including management, sales and marketing, software product management, and training. Her role as an organizer coach and professional organizer combines all these facets of her background. In December 2009, Kathie was among the first 6 professional organizers to earn the credential of Certified Organizer Coach, or COC, from the Institute for Applied Coaching. She also has earned the credential of Certified Professional Organizer, or CPO, from the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals, NAPO. We both belong. Kathie is a member of NAPO Oregon, and my colleague there as well, where she was the Director of Professional Development for 5 years. The Institute for Challenging Disorganization, or ICD, where she teaches a teleclass about taking small steps to challenge disorganization. Portlandia, where she is the co-director of the Better Together Mentor Program and was secretary of the board for 3 years. She is also an active volunteer with Dress for Success Oregon. Kathie facilitates a virtual workshop titled Small Steps to Profound Change and hosts a regular monthly call series titled Making Time for Success. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce you to Kathie England. Kathie?
Thank you so much, Whitney. So I'm going to do the magic with Zoom and do the screen share. So that may take a moment till I get everything up, and then I won't be seeing you for a while, but I will come back after I go through the presentation, and then there'll be opportunities for questions. So keep your Zoom fingers crossed.
And you can feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll read them to Kathie if you'd like to keep them anonymous, or you can raise your hand when she's ready to take questions and you can ask them yourself. Either way, whatever you prefer.
All right, looks like I'm here. The topic this afternoon is right-sizing with ADHD, looking at things that get in the way. I'd like to start with expanding on the definition of right-sizing. Typically, we might think of it as right-sizing your stuff or your space. And the definition I want to include today includes right-sizing how you spend your time, the activities that you engage in, the people that you engage in your life. Because those are other aspects of life. And ADHD, if you happen to have that brain chemistry, that's something that's 24/7. It doesn't go away. So I thought that expanded definition would be of value. So the topics that I'm focusing on this afternoon are defining ADHD and some of its causes, identifying some of the challenges that ADHD presents, and then we'll look at some of the strategies that you can use, particularly when you want to do some right-sizing. Now, the definition of ADHD. This particular definition comes from Roberto Olivardia, who's a PhD. He teaches at Harvard, and he happens to be somebody who has ADHD. So he really knows what he's talking about. And he begins the definition by saying that ADHD is not a mental illness. It's simply a way the brain is wired. And in a few moments, we have a short video that I want to share with you about that brain wiring. Then he makes the point that actually ADHD is not a deficit of attention. So that's the technical attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It isn't really a deficit of attention. It's an inability to regulate attention. Now, let's take a look at the impact of ADHD. There's more than 13 million Americans who have that type of brain wiring. 4.4% of the adults in the United States have ADHD, and yet only about 20% of them have actually been officially diagnosed. ADHD is also a genetic and a neurobiological disorder that creates challenges in 3 key areas: attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And so we'll be looking at those in greater detail as we go on. Now, this is the link to the brief video that we're going to be watching, and that link is on the handout that I think you have received from Devlin. This very short video was created by ADHD magazine, which is one of the references on your handout. It's a fabulous monthly or bi-monthly magazine. So the video is titled "The Neuroscience of the ADHD Brain." Now that video goes by pretty quickly, so I want to underscore, emphasize the things that it talked about, because this really is illustrating the wiring of the ADHD brain. It begins by the fact that there are 2 key neurotransmitters that there's low levels of them with an ADHD wired brain, and those 2 neurotransmitters are dopamine and norepinephrine. And those low levels of neurotransmitters actually impact 4 key regions in the brain: the frontal cortex, limbic system, basal ganglia, and the reticular activating system. The frontal cortex is the area where executive function resides. That's the area that's right behind your forehead. If you put your hand on your forehead, behind that is your prefrontal cortex, where the executive functions are. And that's the key area that is impacted by ADHD brain wiring and those low levels of the neurotransmitter. But the limbic system is also impacted. And as the video showed, the limbic system lies deeper in our brain. It's about in the midbrain area, and it regulates our emotions and also has an impact on regulating our attention. There's a key structure in the limbic system that I want to emphasize. It's a very tiny structure about the size of an almond, and it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala, I'm sure you've heard of before. It controls our fight, flight, or freeze response. Then there's the basal ganglia. And the deficiency in the basal ganglia is it short circuits. So we end up having, this is where inattention and impulsivity can derive from that short circuiting. Then the reticular activating system is the major relay system in our brain, and the neurotransmitter deficiencies in that area can cause impulsivity, inattention, or hyperactivity. The area you primarily hear about when you talk about ADHD, though, is the frontal cortex, specifically the prefrontal cortex. So now let's shift into looking at some of the challenges that are created with ADHD brain wiring. We'll look at some of the characteristics of the brain and some of the most common symptoms that have the potential to get in the way when you're right sizing. So, characteristics of the ADHD brain. One of the most recognized ones is the brain is under-aroused, and that's caused by those two neurotransmitter insufficiencies, both the dopamine and the norepinephrine. But the ADHD brain also can be uninhibited, and that uninhibited characteristic is caused by low levels of something called GABA, which stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Then another factor that has some significant implications is that the frontal lobes are actually slower to mature in an individual with ADHD brain wiring. In a neurotypical person, that's somebody who doesn't have ADHD, the prefrontal cortex typically is considered to be mature by about the age of 25. Not 21, but 25. In an individual with ADHD, that maturity generally isn't reached until closer to the age of 30. Throughout the whole development of the brain, though, an individual with ADHD brain wiring typically lags about 30% in their prefrontal cortex executive function development, 30% less than what their chronological age is. So that means if you're 18 and you're about 30% less in your maturity, that means that's actually closer to being the age of 12, which is pretty amazing when you think about at 18, you're now allowed to vote. And this is a very challenging issue for parents to deal with that child who wants to drive, and yet from a maturation level, their executive functions are really not at the point that it's necessarily safe to be behind the wheel. Another interesting factor is that it's genetically linked. In fact, ADHD is considered to be the most genetically or linked or inheritable of all diagnoses. So if you happen to have ADHD brain wiring, somebody in your family, whether it's your immediate family or a few generations back, will have had ADHD. Another factor is the DRD4 gene, which is quite interesting. It's associated with risk-taking and reward-seeking, but time will not allow us to go into the details around that one, but it's pretty fascinating. Now, let's look at some of those symptoms that potentially could get in the way if you're right-sizing. Distractibility, forgetfulness, and impulsivity. So what I invite you to do is, if you have the handout or you just have some paper, jot down how distractibility, forgetfulness, or impulsivity might show up for you if you're in the process of sizing any aspect of your life. And after I finish the presentation, then we'll come back and explore these areas in more detail. Next, executive functions. Those are those areas that are in the prefrontal cortex. I'm using definitions that are presented by Ari Tuckman in his book, Understand Your Brain, Get More Done. And Ari's book is also on your handout. I like his definitions, and because they are really very clear. So we're going to be looking in more detail at each of these 6. But as we look at each of these 6, as I give you those details, I'd like you to take some notes about how you think that might be showing up for you when you have challenges with your right sizing. So first, working memory. Working memory depends on your ability to have attention, focus on something. So you've got to be able to attend to something long enough that it can actually get stored in your brain and processed so that you can get it ultimately into long-term memory and then being able to call it up later. Working memory is one of the things that's associated with losing or misplacing things like a cell phone or glasses. It's also associated with comprehension problems. So if you're engaged in a conversation with somebody who's doing a lot of verbal processing and talking, and you have some working memory challenges, it may be challenging to follow everything they're saying. It can also be an issue if you're reading. Many people who are diagnosed with ADHD find that reading is not something that comes easily, and a lot of that is focused on the working memory. As you're reading, you're not holding on to what you're reading. So again, how does that possibly show up for you in any of those more specific ways of describing what's going on with working memory? Next is a sense of time. Sense of time is something that everyone that I work with who has ADHD talks about it in these areas. The first one is sense of time. That's actually knowing what time it is. It's noticing the passage of time and then being able to plan what it is that you want to do based on knowing what time it is and that passage of time. The second bullet point about predicting how long it's going to take to do something, that is a huge challenge for many people with ADHD brain wiring. There's a tendency to way underestimate how long it's going to take to do something, but the opposite can also be true. People may say, oh yeah, I think that's going to take me an hour, and in reality, maybe it takes 5 minutes. So what happens if you think it's going to take an hour and you don't have an hour, you won't do it. You'll put it off. Another facet of the sense of time is the ability to recalculate your activities based on factors that are going to be changing. And that's something that's recurring throughout our lives. As the day changes, there can be changes within the hour. And with a challenge with sense of time, the ability to recalculate can be difficult. Next, executive function, self-activation. This is about initiating your attention. And if you go back to thinking about working memory, that was about being able to pay attention to something. So initiating attention is one of the challenges created because of those low levels of dopamine and norepinephrine. But not only the ability to get started, but also finishing is part of this executive function of self-activation. And many people who have a diagnosis of ADHD have piles of incomplete projects. And this actually goes along with this third bullet about how boring it is to get started on certain tasks, because certain tasks just are plain boring. Or once you get into a task, maybe it was novel and exciting at the beginning, but finishing is boring. It's not generating dopamine. And that ends up looking like somebody is intentionally procrastinating, but it's not necessarily what's happening. It's there's not enough of those neurotransmitters to get somebody engaged to get to the point of completion. But what can happen is as a deadline approaches, that's going to get dopamine going. And that will get an individual started on an action. And that can work okay. But if that's the way that your entire life is lived, it can take a tremendous toll on you both emotionally and physically even. Self-activation, how does that show up in your right sizing? Next, prospective memory. Now I mentioned first working memory. That was being able to attend long enough to get it into storage, long-term storage. Well, if you're not attending, then the ability to remember, that's going to be very challenging because there isn't anything to remember. Part of prospective memory is reminding yourself about a task that you need to do at the right time. What can often happen is if you're not able to remind yourself of a task at the right time, you may completely forget it, or it looks like you've completely forgotten it because you haven't been able to remind yourself, or there's the tendency to remember only when it's too late, when that deadline is there, but you may have missed the deadline and then it's too late. So that can be hugely stressful in circumstances where there are important deadlines to consider. So working memory, prospective memory, they work together along with self-activation. So these executive functions are very interconnected, even though they have some more specific descriptors behind what they do. Emotional self-control. This is another huge area that most researchers and clinicians who work in the field of ADHD feel is really underappreciated. The tendency to feel and express feelings more strongly than others do, that's one of the characteristics that can happen with challenges in emotional self-control. Again, that insufficiency of dopamine or norepinephrine. And this can begin to show up when there are other people in your life, which we may have fewer people in our lives because of the pandemic right now, but they may be in your life in some way. So emotional self-control is also involved in actually managing your emotions in the moment, being able to monitor them, because many times people with ADHD seem like they're overreacting to something, but that's part of the challenge. Now, another aspect is being able to have perspective about your own emotions and have the perspective about others, how they see how their own emotions are, and they're seeing your emotions. So this is an area that if you are in a partnership with someone who has ADHD brain wiring, it's really important for you both to understand what's actually going on, because somebody may appear to over respond for the circumstances, but it's not that they are volitionally doing that, it's that those darn neurotransmitters aren't helping at the moment. Then the last of the 6 executive functions that Ari mentions are hindsight and forethought. First characteristic is the ability to use the past and the future to guide the present. Well, if you go back to, there's problems with working memory, there's problems with prospective memory, there's not any memory that you can rely on from the past that you're going to be able to look at to help you make decisions in the future. And this is an aspect of ADHD that isn't discussed as frequently as something like inattention or impulsivity. Now, the tendency to react too quickly results in not remembering the past to guide your thinking about what's going to be the best decision to make in the future. So when you're thinking about your right sizing, how might this end up impacting you? So these are the 6 executive functions that could potentially impact your right sizing. So I'd invite you to take any notes about how they show up for you, how you think they might be showing up, and we'll come back to that when the presentation on the slides is finished and I can actually be looking at lots more faces. So now we're going to shift into the next part of the presentation, which is about actually strategies that can help you manage your ADHD, specifically when your focus is on right sizing. So let's look at ADHD treatment. I'm using the definition again provided by Roberto Olivardia. He says the goal in treatment is to create the optimal environment for the ADHD brain. And so this is where it's really important to develop your own self-awareness about what you need, Be able to communicate that to significant others, to colleagues that you may be working with, to family. Another piece he emphasizes, and this can be very maddening, is that not every strategy works for every person with ADHD every time. So even within an individual, you might find a strategy that's pretty effective, but it's not necessarily going to be 100% effective. The third point that Olivardi emphasizes is it takes a lot of effort to figure out what's going to work, but he says it is so worth it in the long run. And he uses himself as an example. He has discovered that he does not have a good working memory. And in presentations, he says, I have learned that I need to write everything down. This is not a character flaw. This is a working memory challenge caused by that insufficient dopamine and norepinephrine. One of the little anecdotes that Olivardi shares is that his mother had ADHD to the max. And when he was still a fetus, she was pretty sure she was going to have a baby who had the same kind of brain chemistry that she has. He was so active, and she did not disappoint him or surprise him. Now, we've got several slides about this topic of response inhibition. This is huge. And I'm going to quote from Ari Tuckman here. Perhaps the single most important strategy in treating ADHD is developing response inhibition, also known as the pause. So if there's one single thing you can take away from this presentation this afternoon, it's about the power of the pause, or more technically defined as response inhibition. Because what happens when you can take even a tiny pause, it gives your executive functions a much better opportunity to do their thing. So I'm going to say this in several different ways. And many of these quotes come from Ari Tuckman. He says the key to successful decision making is a tiny pause, because that tiny pause gives those executive functions, again located in your prefrontal cortex, time to do their thing. You're not operating on automatic pilot where there's a tendency to do things impulsively. He even goes on to say that executive functions actually live in that little space between the stimulus and response. So when you have some kind of a stimulus that has the potential to activate or trigger, if you can learn to take that pause before you respond, it can have a huge difference in the quality of your life. Tuckman says again, people with ADHD have difficulty stopping long enough to create the pause. And when that happens, they don't use their executive functions as reliably as is possible, as they could do. He says the ability to stop creates a pause, and that allows you to think through what your response options are. And I was having this conversation this morning with a client that I've been working with for several months. We talked about the challenge of transitions, going from one thing to the next. And what we came up with, I emphasize for him, is what does it look like to pause when you finished one thing and you're ready to go some other direction. So again, if you remember only thing out of this afternoon, it's the pause and response inhibition. I actually have a quote from one of my clients about the pause. She said, "Learning to pause has been the most beneficial skill I learned in coaching. I recently taught it to my father and it blew his mind." And this was a woman, I believe she was probably in her early 40s, so her father would be somewhat older than that. Also, they share that brain chemistry of ADHD wiring, and the concept of pausing had never been introduced to him. So she was so grateful that it was then in her life. Now, Russell Barkley is a name I haven't mentioned yet, but he's perhaps one of the most renowned of all researchers in the field of ADHD today. And this is one of the most famous things he's ever said. And it's translated in lots of different ways. So I haven't put it in quotes because it's the essence I wanted you to get. He says, people with ADHD know what to do, but they don't do what they know. They know what to do. They don't do what they know. So Ari Tuckman says a little bit more about this. And this is an exact quote from Ari. People with ADHD don't always do what they know because they have trouble creating that pause that gives them time to consider a decision. So again, learning to take that pause maybe feel artificial, but it's not like you have to pause for 5 minutes each time. A 5-minute pause could be very beneficial depending on the context, but learning to pause even for a few seconds can be hugely impactful. So I invite you to take a few notes for yourself about when you think about pausing, what might be some of the benefits for you in right sizing or in any other aspect of your life. Now, I'm referring to Ari Tuckman again. He talks about 3 ways to change performance. The first one is to improve your abilities by giving your brain what it needs to function best. And the next slide is absolutely going to focus on that issue. Then he says, actively approach rather than avoid things, challenges, but approach these challenges with better strategies that you've developed because you're using your executive function effectively. And then his third recommendation is to alter the situation so the demands better fit your abilities. And this is a key point when you look at your work, your relationship, how you live, how you right size. So this is the second slide I said that reflects what Ari just said about improving your abilities by giving your brain what it needs to function at its best. This is making the most of what you've got. And it begins with good mental health. A piece that I want to share with you is that about 40 to 70% of people with ADHD have other diagnoses like anxiety disorder or depression. And there's a host of other brain-based conditions that often coexist with ADHD. If you have any of those areas or suspect that you might, it's really important to get help from a mental health professional to make the most of what you've got. And one of the things that's particularly interesting to women, although it's not widely known among gynecologists and physicians who specialize with women, is that hormonal changes throughout the life of a woman can dramatically impact her ability to function if she has ADHD. Women within their periods may have much greater emotional swings. When a woman hits perimenopause or menopause, these can be much more dramatic. They're hard enough for women who would be considered neurotypical, but the reactions can be even greater with a woman with ADHD, and she may think she's going crazy. So this is where it's important to have that awareness. And some of the writers about ADHD who specialize in writing about women are starting to address this issue. But it is something that I share with all my female clients, regardless of their age. Second thing that's important about making the most of what you got is your good physical health. And your good physical health is going to be dependent upon all these facets that are listed on this screen. Now you notice that both sleep and regular exercise I've underlined. I wanted to give you some extra emphasis. Sleep is a challenge for many people with ADHD because the brains don't turn off. And so when it's time to go to bed, it's very hard to quiet the brain. And yet when people do not get enough sleep, whether they have ADHD brain wiring or not, sleep is hugely detrimental to our ability to function as humans. Managing stress is another part of making the most of what you've got. And two of the most important things you can do that are get a good amount of sleep and exercise. Good nutrition is extremely important. One of the side effects of some of the medications that are prescribed with ADHD is they are actually appetite suppressors. And so someone may go through the course of the day and not feel hungry, but that doesn't mean that your brain and your body don't need nutrition, particularly small amounts of protein throughout the day. So good nutrition is essential. Moderate alcohol use and minimal drug use are recommended. And then regular exercise. And you might have heard people say that if exercise could be bottled as a pill or something that you take, it would be the most widely used pill that exists, even beyond Viagra or others. Because regular exercise for everybody, but particularly with ADHD, has a huge impact on mood, attention, memory, and learning. So response inhibition and making the most of what you've got. These are the most important things that you can do to help yourself function optimally in right sizing or any other aspect of your life. Ari Tuckman then talks about some strategies to help improve response inhibition. So he looks at the standpoint of first inattention. His strategies are to reduce extraneous stimuli and amplify important ones. So if you tend to be the inattentive form of ADHD, one of the kinds of extraneous stimuli that can really be distracting is a cell phone and all the things that you can access through the internet. All those apps and those wonderful devices, they can be really distracting. And so this is a kind of extraneous stimuli that you may really want to reduce if you're going to be focusing on right sizing or focusing on some other aspect. Making the stimuli really stand out, writing something you need to do in bright colors, posting it where you can see it, doing a graphic to represent, I need to do this at 5 o'clock. Okay, that's the inattention. Now looking at hyperactivity. He talks about seeking out situations that are going to allow you to have safe expression of your hyperactivity. Well, this is where I want to point out that hyperactivity generally looks different in children than it does in adults. Hyperactivity, you think of the little kid running around and just can never be still. That usually doesn't end up the way it looks as an adult, but the brain that doesn't show up can be hyperactive. That's where it's hard to slow down, quiet your brain to go to sleep. One of the things that can help with the expression of hyperactivity, particularly as an adult, is to stand and to move. If you have a partner and you need to talk about something important, it's much better that the two of you go walking somewhere. It's walking and talking is a way that you can much more effectively be communicating. Standing desks are another thing that can be very valuable. You may think of when you're going to do some right sizing, you got to sit down and you really got to focus on stuff, but that may be the worst thing to do, to sit down. It may be much better to stand so that you're able to move to help improve your response inhibition. Then minimize or avoid situations that require more restraint than you can. Your cell phone may be one of those devices that require more restraint than is easily gained. One of my clients used to refer to his cell phone as his evil cell phone because it was so tempting when he was ready to go to bed. It was very difficult to put it down. So he actually created like a little bed for his cell phone to live in when he went to bed, and he put that bed in another room. And this really helped him if he woke up in the middle of the night, because the tendency was to grab that phone. Okay, you can imagine what happened then. Middle of the night, He's awakened, he grabs the phone, doesn't usually get back to sleep. Impulsivity. This is about creating barriers to problematic actions by removing tempting stimuli, which is like removing that cell phone, putting it into another room. And to build in cushions to reduce potential damage. That's it. What would that look like? If you know it's going to take longer and you may do something, you want to build in extra time, and that's where that pause may come into play. Now, these are 4 strategies that I offer. I call them 4S strategies about help that can help you when things get in the way when you want to right size or any of your life. First, start small, take a small step. One of my favorite books is called One Small Step Can Change Your Life. And in that book, the author gives a definition of a small step. He says the step needs to be so small that you are as sure you can take that step as you are the sun will rise tomorrow. So that is how small that step is. It may seem ridiculously small, but it's getting started. This goes along with the lack of dopamine. If you can take a really, really tiny step, it may not take too much dopamine to do that, but then continue to take more small steps. Next, set a timer. Timers have 2 great advantages. One is sprints, the other is boundaries. A long time ago, there was a television show called Beat the Clock, and it was a game show, and the contestants raced the clock. Well, setting a timer can do the same thing for you. That actually can get some dopamine going. Set aside 15 minutes on a timer, and you're going to race the clock to see how fast can you fold laundry, and it gets that dopamine going. But then the boundary part comes in. There's sprints, there's boundaries. The boundary comes in when the timer stops, you stop. Because you're learning then that you can get started on something, but you don't get so absorbed that you go into hyperfocus and you totally lose track of time. A third S strategy is set an appointment with yourself. And by setting an appointment with yourself, I literally mean get it on a calendar, whether it's paper or electronic. Set a day, set a time, an amount of time. And then when that appointment comes around, you set the timer for the amount you've allocated, and then you start with your small step. The 4th S is self-talk. This is about changing the story. And when you think of self-talk, if you're honest with yourself, most of the time the self-talk we have is not very friendly to us. It's the negative stuff. It's I'm too old, I'm too dumb, I'm too small, I'm too tall, I'm too short, I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I'm too fill in the blank. That's the self-talk. And usually self-talk is a reflection of very limiting beliefs. But we have the capacity to change the story. And that's because our brains have something called neuroplasticity. We can change that story. Neuroplasticity means that when we start practicing that new story, we create new neural pathways, and we can go down those new pathways and we can change our self-talk. So these 4 S's are extremely important. After putting the presentation together, I decided there's actually a 5th S, and that's self-care, which is what we talked about in that earlier slide about making the most of what you've got. So if you want to make a note to yourself, the 5th S is self-care and all those aspects of it. So now when I talked about neuroplasticity, I talked about practicing. So I invite you to think about this quotation. What we practice, we become. Those are words from Thomas Sterner in his book, The Practicing Mind. So, as a result of this presentation today, what are you going to practice when things get in the way? Is it response inhibition? Is it removing that evil cell phone so you're got that extraneous stimuli out of your way? What are you going to practice when things get in the way? I have some references for you, resources that are also listed on your handout. CHAD is for children and adults. It's a fabulous organization, a wealth of information on the website. ADA, which is an organization that focuses only on adults, not on kids. And again, a wealth of information. These two organizations, along with a third one called the ADHD Coaches Organization, will be hosting the International Conference on ADHD. And in the past, those conferences have always been in person. This year, this is called the 2020 Virtual International Conference on ADHD. It's to be held on November 5th through the 7th. One of the advantages of this being a virtual conference is they've announced that the conference sessions will be available for 2 weeks following the actual conference. Now, a benefit if you join CHAD or ADA, you'll get a reduced rate when you go to register for the conference. They have not announced the rates yet, nor have they announced the speakers or their topics, but it's something that I highly recommend. I've gone to this conference for about 5 years now, and there's more information than you can begin to absorb. There are physicians, there are researchers, there's coaches, there's teachers, there's psychologists, there's parents, there's kids, adult kids. It's a wealth of people, and the majority of the people who attend that conference do have ADHD. So many people like attending it because they're saying like, I'm with my tribe now. Then other resources. This podcast, Translating ADHD, was started last fall. It's run by two colleagues of mine, Cameron Gott and Shelley Collins, both of whom have ADHD. They upload a new episode every week. So since last fall, there's quite a few episodes out there, but it is free, although they have created a Discord community for $5 a month. You can actually interact with them, but I highly recommend this podcast. ADD2 Magazine, which I had mentioned earlier, and then Understand Your Brain, Get More Done, the book by Ari Tuckman. I want to conclude the actual slides in this part of the presentation with this quote: small steps actually taken lead to more progress than great steps that never happen. And this is a quotation from Marilyn Paul in her book, It's Hard to Make a Difference When You Can't Find Your Keys. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides. And Whitney, are there questions that have come in, or are there people who would be willing to share some of those areas where I invited you to take some notes?
We have one comment.
Okay.
Mavis says that Translating ADHD, the podcast, is fabulous.
Okay. Thank you, Mavis, for that testimonial. So let's look at that area that I invited you to look at: distractibility, forgetfulness, and impulsivity. Did anybody note any areas that might show up if you're in the process of right-sizing or any other aspect of your life? Anybody willing to share? Sheila, you want to unmute yourself?
So I was just wondering, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I was wondering if dopamine is a hormone.
It's a neurotransmitter.
Okay, but what is it transmitting?
Signals to your brain.
Okay, so
that's what neurotransmitters do.
Okay, so women would probably more likely have a variation in levels of this during, like you mentioned,
exactly,
times and all of that.
Because not only will it impact the hormones, which are different than neurotransmitters, and I could not give you a technical difference at the moment, but yes, that will fluctuate.
But I'm wondering, is there a specific, like a study about it? Because, you know, maybe that a person may have all of the symptoms of ADHD, but never, not until maybe they reached menopause, or maybe, you know, it comes along later.
Well, actually, it's an interesting question you raise, and it's a more complicated answer, but it's really important. Technically, when you are diagnosed by somebody who has the right credentials to do a diagnosis, they will ask if this issue persisted from childhood. And many women will say, well, no. In fact, I've got a great article about a woman who's, no, I didn't have any problems. I got straight A's. She was precluded from treatment because this definition of this insurance company said it had to come from childhood. But what happens is many women have been able to manage their symptoms. But when they hit perimenopause or menopause, those hormonal functions were like the tipping point then, that shifted to that point that they could no longer keep it together. That it can happen for women who may go through high school, great, family provides structure, may make it into college and fall apart, or may do great in college because college still has a lot of structure, but first job or getting married, having a first child, having a second child, all those kind of things that are happening can be those tipping points that push a woman over the edge.
Yeah.
And it can push a neurotypical woman over the edge too.
Yeah.
But a woman with ADHD is more susceptible to those challenges. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, it does. And one more thing I'd like to say to you is that, you say you recommend that people set timers. Well, I had a timer. I used it and broke it. I used it so much. Thank you, Kathie. So now what I do is I listen to music while I'm working. So I'll say I'm going to listen to 3 songs. And by then I'll get whatever this project is. I'll finish it. Even if it's not finished, I need to go and do something else. Otherwise, it will never get finished.
Well, I thank you for sharing that, because I had a client who had created a playlist for take a shower. So he would turn the music on and he knew where he needed to be so that he could get his shower done, because otherwise he was very inattentive and he could just be in that shower forever.
That's hilarious.
But knowing the playlist, so it's the same sort of thing. And Sheila, thank you for mentioning timers. This is one of the favorite tools called the Time Timer. Timetimer.com is where you can buy it. You can also get it off of Amazon. But what happens, it makes time visible. So as the time passes, the red gets smaller. And so when you have a challenge with sense of time, because it's such an abstract concept, making it visible like that can be hugely impactful. The time timers were originally created for kids with ADHD, but I found it's really popular with adults, and they come in a whole host of sizes. And I got an email from the time timer company today that they're having some kind of a wonderful special on. So check them out, timetimer.com.
Will do. Thank you.
Whitney, any other questions?
Many people are agreeing with Sheila's use of music, that's a great way to track time, like a non-traditional way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where the creativity of ADHD shows up. In this presentation, I was really focused on the things that get in the way, but there could be a whole other presentation that's focused on what are the positive sides of having ADHD brain chemistry. And that's one of the things that the Translating ADHD podcast provides, is Cam and Shelley talk a lot about of both aspects, not just the downsides, but the positive aspects, which are a really important part in a concept about neurodiversity. And it's breaking away from the idea that there's the medical model, that this is a diagnosis and somebody has to be fixed. It's about appreciating each person's unique brain wiring, whether it's ADHD, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's dyslexia, any other things, just like we're looking at appreciating a diverse society, that one side is not right, one side is not wrong. These are all things we can encompass. And so it's another aspect of inclusion.
And Casey's comment flows into that. Casey writes, I really appreciate the goal is to create the optimal environment for the ADHD brain.
Exactly. And that's where knowing yourself is so important. So as you look at these things like distractibility or forgetfulness, so if you have forgetfulness, like with what Roberto Olivaria says, I got to write it down. I know this. Well, he obviously has been pretty effective if he's a PhD who teaches at Harvard. So writing down has not been a barrier to his success. Many clients I find feel like they're, oh, that's embarrassing to have to write stuff down. I say if it's good enough for Roberto Olivardia, it's good enough for you.
Absolutely. Deb, I'm wondering, I don't quite understand your comment. Could you talk about changing the external rather than trying to make the brain do something it doesn't want to do?
Yeah,
This is Deb.
that comes from when I worked with young children, elementary age children. I was lucky enough to work in a Montessori where if a child has ADHD or executive functioning issues, or even if they were undiagnosed, but like it was obvious they had some executive functioning issue, instead of trying to force them to be like every other like child with a typical brain, we would change their environment. And I'm thinking of like, we had these amazing wobbly chairs, like so many children, maybe I remember when I was in school, if someone, myself included, like leaned back on a chair, we would get in trouble because it's not
Big
safe.
trouble.
Yeah, because it's not safe. So there's, these chairs that are designed for children who are wobbly, and maybe they need to go outside and like jump rope more than other children, and just instead of trying to force their brain to conform to like the norm, which what does that even mean, the norm? We would set them up for success.
And that's the same idea. That's the same perspective. There's a great book called Fidget to Focus that really talks about all the ways that fidgeting, which is, you tend to think about somebody when your mother would tell you, stop fidgeting, or your teacher. That's a huge way to focus. Some people have found knitting is a great way. Doesn't matter what your gender is, both men and women. Knitting can be a great way to focus. One of the stories in Fidget to Focus, he talks about an attorney who's involved in a lot of trial work litigation, attorney with ADHD. And to keep himself focused, he discovered that if he wore shirts that had his monogram on the cuff, he could gently run his finger across that cuff. He was getting that tactile stimulation, and that alone helped him to focus. So that was a pretty unobtrusive sort of thing, although people would say, geez, you're pretty hoity-toity getting all those initials on your, but that's what he learned. And that's knowing your brain of what works for you and creating the environment that works for you and helping the people around you, particularly if you live with them or you work with them. This is the way to optimize the function. And many people with ADHD are very successful. And so there's more and more attention to some of the people like Richard Branson, is it Virgin Airlines?
Virgin Atlantic, I think, yeah.
Is ADHD. Well, just like Roberto Olivardia, this hasn't held him back.
We have a comment on what you were just talking about. I used to get in trouble in school and church for crocheting and drawing. It wasn't until art college that I was allowed to do those things and could finally pay attention.
Perfect example. Perfect example.
And we do have a question.
Okay.
Kathie, do you find that out of the 5 S's you mentioned, there's a particular one you would recommend someone start with if they're just beginning their right-sizing journey? Or is there a particular S that your ADHD clients typically find they turn to most in their efforts to right-size?
I am a big proponent of small steps. Anybody who's worked with me knows that's one of the first things that we talk about. Whether you have ADHD brain wiring or not, because the power of a very small step can give you that sense of success. And one of the things I encourage people to do is when you take that small step, notice that success, because that helps shift the self-talk about I'm so fill in the blank negative. And the more you can acknowledge and see those successes that you're doing, you begin to see yourself in a different way. Because the self-talk for people who have gone through their life being out of step with the rest of the world can be pretty devastating. And so by building success, one of the things that Cam, who's on the Translating ADHD podcast, talks about is completion chemistry, that when you finish a small step, or doesn't have to be just small steps, your brain releases another neurotransmitter, serotonin. And serotonin makes us feel good. Think of you've completed, you finally got the laundry put away, you finally got the dishwasher unloaded, or, rather mundane tasks. But if you allow yourself to realize, oh, that feels so good, that's serotonin at work. So that's better living through your neurotransmitters.
There's a lot of agreement in the chat about the completion chemistry and people liking that starting with small steps being their favorite S step. And there's a comment, it said, it's so good for those of us who perform best when there's a reward or sense of completion involved. And we have another comment. When I worked in a cubicle environment, it was extremely difficult to focus between the noise and the interruptions. I had to work remotely or find a small room to get away in order to concentrate. Now my distractions are the many tasks of organizing and downsizing.
That's a particular challenge in the world where a lot of offices have gone to the open office. There's no offices, there's cubes, and you can hear all the sound. I've had some clients who've actually been able to get some accommodations to be able to create some barriers, or to work in a small room, or working remotely, which then presents as other challenges of all the other distractions if you're in a home office. And that's a whole other presentation.
Well, we would love to have you back. If I might ask one more question, does anybody else have a question for Kathie? Kathie, for those of us who maybe we don't know that we or a loved one have ADHD, is there a resource or a quiz or something that you can point us to where maybe it would ask us some questions and we might have a better sense of where to go from there?
You can go to ADD Etude magazine and just put that in your search, and they have quizzes that you can take. I think there are similar quizzes available on the CHAD website. I'm not recalling one offhand, but I'm pretty sure that, because that is such a common sort of challenge, is like, do I or don't I?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of times, I've had several clients who their physicians who did the diagnosis or the psychologist said, yeah, you're kind of like right on the edge, and I'm not going to officially give you that diagnosis. And yet behaviorally, everything that I saw in our work together said to me, yes, this was ADHD brain wiring at work. And that's one of the advantages of having a diagnosis, is knowing, okay, I'm not crazy. This is just my brain wiring. There's not enough dopamine and norepinephrine. That's not my fault. It goes back in my genetics. And so what can I do with that awareness? So it's not about having a label, but it's recognizing, now that I know, what can I do with that awareness?
Yeah, it becomes a tool then, that self-knowledge.
Exactly.
We have a comment that OHSU Adult Psychology has a good website to go to.
Wonderful.
Also have comments related to the working in an office environment. Someone said, I had a very similar experience. I love working from home. I'm very curious how many other participants like working from home or find that it's a better solution for them. Casey writes that she's far more productive and has less travel time. Sheila says, thank you for this event. She has to go. And Devin writes, I love working from home for many reasons, but focus-wise, I tend to get distracted trying to socialize if I'm in an office environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that can be a situation where practicing boundaries is really important. And even putting a sign on the door, you know, like Lucy and Peanuts cartoon, and doctor's in. Okay, if the doctor is not in right now, I'm out, gone fishing, be back at whatever time. And that's a kind of boundary that really is important, because that's working with your brain, because the interruptions are so highly destructive of your time management, because your brain can't really multitask. It toggles back and forth. So every time you're interrupted, you have to start up again. And there's some startup time that doesn't always get factored into your thinking. So it's extremely important to recognize you don't have to be 100% accessible in whatever you do.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving us the permission to give ourselves to do that.
Yes,
Sometimes
absolutely.
that's a huge barrier for folks. It's just giving ourselves permission to set those boundaries.
Mm-hmm. The client I was working with just before I came here, is she has recognized that working from home and the kind of job that she has, there are only so many hours that she actually can work. And rather than thinking she's going to squeeze in all these other things through all these other times when she's watching her 4-year-old child, and she co-parents with the husband and they rotate, and she says, it doesn't work. And so setting that boundary, even if you are self-employed, is an important awareness of what works for your brain. Because when you think you're going to try to do it, it's like static in the background. You're beating yourself up because I'm so bad because I'm not getting this done. And again, that's where the opportunity to change the narrative, write a new script, can be hugely powerful.
Absolutely. Kathie, we don't want to keep you way over time. We could talk about this for a whole day.
I love talking about this. So I'm delighted to have had this opportunity, and I hope you all remember response inhibition.
Yes, that pause.
And small steps.
Thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you have shared with us today, and for sharing your passion for working with those of us who have an ADHD brain.
Well, my pleasure. So thank you for inviting me.